Hello there. You're listening to the Box Office Show. I'm Dylan Johnson, and there is no Ryan Hill yet again today because he's filming his feature film, Painted Faces, which you can follow on their official Instagram, Painted Faces the Movie, on Instagram. I'm going to be talking about the box office numbers from last weekend, as always, and our box office predictions for this upcoming weekend, and then I will be doing a brief director's analysis on Richard Linklater, touching only upon his darker comedies, Bernie, and the very recently made Hitman. Let's do our box office breakdown for the weekend of June 7th to the 9th. In its debut weekend, coming in first, Bad Boys Ride or Die with $56 million. That's impressive. That's good. That's a good opening for the fourth installment in a franchise. I believe this is the fourth. It's got to be, right? Very, very impressive outing for something that has lasted this long. I mean, it's a 20-year-old franchise. The actors are certainly older. Will Smith has taken kind of a few hits, in the last few years with the slap and whatnot. And this is kind of like his big comeback, and it had a very good outing. It did very, very well. In second place was the Garfield movie with $10 million. In third was If with $7.8 million. In fourth, in its debut weekend, The Watchers with $7 million, which is quite a little bit under my prediction. I was hoping it would at least get to 14 for, a debut horror movie coming out, especially this time of year where there's nothing really else to compete with in the horror market. Still underperformed. Definitely a little disappointing. In fifth, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, still holding on to the top five, which is very impressive, with $5.4 million. Furiosa and Mad Max getting knocked under Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes with $4.2 million. In seventh, The Fall Guy with $2.6 million. In eighth, interestingly enough, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring re-release with $2.5 million. And in ninth, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers re-release with $1.9 million. And just after that, The Strangers Chapter 1, the only other big horror movie on the market right now, with $1.8 million. That rounds out our top 10, and now I can go ahead and do our box office predictions for the weekend of June 14th to the 16th. There's only one big movie coming out. It's Inside Out 2, baby. It's coming. It's coming out, and it is on my roster for the box office draft. It was my first pick, and oh man, I needed to do big numbers. I needed to make huge numbers because this was a good pick for me, if you ask me. It was a good, strong first pick. But Ryan's first pick was Despicable Me 4, which we all know is going to make $1 billion. Like, it's pretty much guaranteed. Inside Out 2, to me, was a little more of a risk. I mean, the first movie did do good numbers. It is a sequel to a very popular movie. It's a Pixar movie. It has a chance to do really good numbers. I'm very nervous about it, though. Though, the predictions are saying it could have a $100 million opening, which is really, really good signs. Really, really strong. I'm really hoping for it. I'm hoping it gets over 100 million. I'm thinking it can do it. Everybody go see Inside Out 2. Please, 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 please. It would be incredible if I could destroy Ryan at this game. It would be absolutely stellar. Dune 2 already did really good in my roster. Kung Fu Panda 4 did a fairly good amount in my roster. Ryan is, of course, doing okay with Godzilla X Kong, and he's got Despicable Me 2, Despicable Me 4 coming out soon. I think, dude, I'm telling you, I think I got him. I think I got him this year, which would be awesome. I'm going to win this one, and I'm going for the double whammy with the Oscar draft for this year as well, next year. I'm looking forward to it, to give him a double whammy. And then if I can get the box office draft for the year after, that's 3 in a row. None of us, neither of us. Actually, wait, he might have done 3 in a row. Okay, so he did 3 in a row once in the very first. He might have done 3 in a row, which is a really big bummer. I can't remember. But if I could get him 3 in a row, ooh, that would be so good. These long-running sort of competitions of ours, they are thrilling to say the least. And, God, it's been a while since I won one. It's been a year. I won the last box office draft, so it's been a year because he won the Oscar draft this past year. I need a win. I definitely need a win. And this would be a very, very good win for me because, he was so cocky in the box office draft. I was cockier. That is fair. but he was very cocky. But I think I got him. I think I finally got that son of a bitch. Oh yeah, this is gonna be good. That's 2 box office drafts in a row I would have won. Oh man, he's gonna be kicking himself. Oh, he's gonna be so sad. He's gonna have to use his replacement pick. I think he's gonna have to replace Twisters. Twisters is gonna come out. I bet you he's gonna underperform a little bit, and he's gonna have to replace it with something by the end of the year. What it's gonna be, I don't know. He could pick Beetlejuice 2, not to give him any ideas or anything, but he could pick Beetlejuice 2. There's not much else coming out this year that we haven't already picked that's going to do insane amounts of money. So maybe Twisters is the best bet after all. Who knows? Anyway, we can move on to our main topic of discussion, which is going to be a semi-director analysis. I mean, it's very, very brief. We've already talked about Richard Linklater on this podcast before. We are doing our recurring sort of shows about the Before trilogy that we're recording every 9 months, I think. Yeah, 9 months because the movies came out 9 years apart, so we're recording it 9 months apart. So we're doing that. But then, I think we've talked about School of Rock before at some point, but never have we done like a dedicated director analysis to Richard Linklater. And this isn't even really quite that. I'm only talking about 2 of his movies, and that's just because I feel like they're very linked thematically and story-wise. I'm talking about Bernie and Hitman, which were 2 dark comedies separated by 12 years in his filmography. And the common thread here is that they were both scripts came about as a result of an article written by Skip Hollandsworth, who is a journalist. So they have similar kind of tones about them in terms of balancing these very dark ideas with very sitcom-y, lighthearted scenes and whatnot. And so they do go very much hand in hand with one another. When I was watching Hitman, it reminded me a lot of Bernie. And I was like, this reminds me a lot of Bernie. And I looked it up. I didn't even realize that Bernie was a Richard Linklater movie when I was watching Hitman, which is what gave me the idea to do this episode, to sort of link the 2 together. And I think there will be other director analysis about Richard Linklater down the line, because I'm sure Ryan will want to touch upon his animated films that he has. Perhaps we'll talk about Boyhood at some point. There's just so much to his filmography that we could touch upon. This is just a very small subsection. I mean, we could talk about Dazed and Confused. We could talk about Everybody Wants Some. There's so much to talk about in regards to Richard Linklater that this doesn't feel like a very encapsulating director's analysis. It doesn't feel like a very full look at his filmography, which is why it's weird to call it a director's analysis. But I am going to be comparing 2 movies. I guess it's more of a director. I can't say a director comparison. It's the same director, but just 2 movies of his that are similar. So I'm going to call it a director's analysis. You can think of it however you want. We will probably come back to Richard Linklater at some point. I all but guarantee it. I mean, he's at least very impactful for me in terms of the movies he's made. I'm sure Ryan feels that way too, especially with the Before trilogies, the dialogue that they have, which we're already talking about that anyway on the show over a long period of time. I'm sure when Merrily We Roll Along comes out in, I don't know, 50,000 years, whenever he finishes filming that, because it's going to take him that long to film it. I'm sure we'll talk about that if the show still exists by then. I mean, God knows. I think legitimately is supposed to come out in 10 years. I think it's going to take him 10 years to film, much like Boyhood took him 12 years to film, which is ridiculous. But he just likes these longer projects. So if this show still exists when that comes out, we'll probably talk about Boyhood in that. But who knows what we're going to be doing in 10 years. I could be dead by then. I have no idea. He could be dead by then. For the love of God. I mean, it's a crazy idea, a very ambitious thing to do, is to film a movie over the course of that long period of time. Any of his actors could be dead by then. Who knows? It's just a bold choice to make. So we'll see. Anyway, let's focus on what I'm trying to actually talk about, which is Bernie and Hitman. Let's start with Bernie. Bernie came out in 2011. Of course, is based on an article by Skip Hollandsworth, and is based completely on a true story about the real Bernie Tiede, who was a mortician in a small East Texas town, who was beloved by everybody in the town, a very popular figure, cornerstone of the community, befriender of widows. He was a mortician. He's a very nice guy. He would befriend widows, hang out with them, and try and help them mourn the loss of their deceased elderly husbands. And befriended this one widow, Marjorie Nugent, became very close with her, became her personal confidant, her her practically a chauffeur, very close assistant almost, and then killed her, shot her, and stuck her in a deep freezer and pretended like she wasn't dead for 9 months. It's a very crazy story, and from the outside, without knowing anything about the story, it seems very, very dark. This idea that like this guy who was supposedly a good man, supposedly a cornerstone of his community, would it sounds like a story where he's preying upon an elderly woman and taking advantage of her and uh, trying to use her wealth because she's a wealthy widow to his own advantage. And when you watch the movie, and I'm sure when you read the article too, I haven't read the article, but when you watch the movie at least, you realize very quickly that it's not that kind of story at all. Bernie is our protagonist of the film. He's very much like the good guy, and it's an interesting way to approach the film as well as was what Richard Linklater did, because it's based on an article. A lot of the film is told from interview perspectives of people who, some of which are actors and some of which are actually people who lived in that town at that time, recalling stories of the real Bernie Tiede. And it's sort of fit with filmed sequences in between those interviews and whatnot. So we learn a lot of exposition about who Bernie is, about who Marjorie Nugent is, about how their situations work, about who they are as people, from the perspectives of these East Texas citizens and whatnot. And then we start to see more of their dynamic together in the film sections about them interacting, about how they seem like a good pair, and then very quickly it becomes very clear that Marjorie is abusive towards him and very crazy and controlling over his time and jealous of his time and whatnot. And we could see very easily how that could become overbearing quite quickly. And of course, it's explained that this takes place over 2 years, where he falls into this sort of pattern of being her like personal servant pretty much, and it becomes overbearing quite quickly. And so it's trying to explain a lot all at once. It's trying to give a lot of exposition. It's trying to give us backgrounds on these characters, and it's trying to like fill in a lot of information all at once, as well as make us understand why Bernie would do this and still be a good person. It's trying to make the argument for why Bernie Tiede is still a good person, even though he murdered somebody, that he was trying his best and that he was in an impossible situation, and that this was just a choice that was made. Like this killing was like a snap decision of a man at the end of his limits, and that in no way should be a reflection of who he is as a person. And that's a bold argument for any movie to make, let alone this one, where it's very goofy and very funny, and Jack Black is the main character. Shirley MacLaine plays Marjorie Nugent, and Matthew McConaughey's in it as well. Like it's very, very strong choice to have such a comedy based movie be about something that is very dark and very intense. And I think it does have a lot of pros to it, but I think there are also quite a few cons. And I want to start with the cons a little bit, particularly the interview style structure of the film. I think is a very strong way to start it off. This is a true story. The people who are involved are very much still alive because it happened in 1996 or so, 1992, 93, 94, 96. That era, the mid 90s. Those people are still alive, still well. This movie was made only 20-ish, less than 20 years afterwards. So all these people are still around. They very much remember this because it's a small town. This is the big news of like the century that this event happened. So they all have all these emotions and whatnot still within them, and they can still recall all these characters that are involved in it, even if they haven't seen them in a long time, and they can remember everything that was going on very, very clearly. So structuring the beginning of that film, I think, is a very strong choice. I think it is able to give a lot of exposition that we would need to fully understand the story very quickly and in a fun manner that also sort of contextualizes what this East Texas town is like, gives us a lot of background on the town life and the people who are in it and what they're like as people. And it just feeds us all kinds of information in a very, very quick, like 20 minutes of This is who Bernie TD is. This is his background. This is where he comes from. This is who he is. This is how we know him. This is how we relate to him. This is Marjorie Nugent. This is where she comes from. This is her relation to her family. This is everything that we know about her. This is how rich she is. This is who she is as a person. Yada 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 yada. It just like sheds all this information very very fast, and I think that's very strong. I take issue with how they continue the interviews throughout the whole thing. I feel like it detracts from the storytelling once you get about 30 minutes in, and I feel like it could have become a lot more restrained as the movie goes on, and then by the time you get like 2/3 of the way through the movie, you could have pulled back and not use the public interviews until the very end at all, because at that point we become so familiar with the characters and how they interact and whatnot that I'm more interested in seeing Jack Black and Shirley MacLaine interact with one another, seeing how the tax or the financial advisor is investigating Jack Black to find Marjorie Nugent once she's dead. Seeing how all the characters interact, how Danny Buck, the lawyer, is investigating Jack Black and capitalizing on the attention that he's getting. All these things I think are very, very interesting aspects that I think get undercut because of all the time it cuts back to the interviews and whatnot. I think that becomes distracting, which is a little frustrating as a viewer, especially because the movie does have very funny moments where Jack Black is either doing something completely ridiculous as he's committed very wholeheartedly to the role, or there's bits where Shirley MacLaine is doing something absolutely ridiculous because she's committed to the role, and they're like giving really good performances. And I would want to spend more time with them as performers, embodying these characters and learning more about the characters through the way they act and the way they interact with each other, as opposed to continuing to just hammer down the point that this is a real story and here are the people and their impressions of what happened. It becomes like pseudo documentary at that point, and because this is a like fictional take of a nonfiction story, this is a performed version of it. I would rather leave the documentary aspects to the exposition of what had happened, like the facts of what had happened, to that part, and taking the impressions and left it mostly to our interpretation of what we're watching. Just because, I mean, we're hearing everybody's opinions on Marjorie Nugent, and we're hearing everybody's opinions on Bernie, and it's like they're telling me how I should be feeling about these characters and what they did. And I wish it was more of a conversation of, this is more or less what we think happened from what we can tell. What are your impressions of Bernie TD as a person? Do you think he's a good person? Do you think he made a mistake? Do you think it was premeditated? Do you think he just didn't know what he was doing? Do you think it was a lapse in judgment in the moment? Do you think he was just overwhelmed by feelings of pressure? And I think I would have come to the conclusion that it would have, that yes, Bernie is did a terrible thing. He murdered a person. It's horrible. It doesn't matter if that woman was mean or kind or whoever she was. Her personality doesn't matter in judgment of a crime. He did kill her. But I would argue that you could make the argument that it was a lapse of judgment and not premeditated, which is, you know, what the legal argument is towards the end of the movie. And then that becomes the other problem, is when you get to that final like courtroom sequence and you have Danny Buck arguing with the other lawyer, and the whole context of the argument is about whether or not it was premeditated to determine what level of punishment Bernie should face. I think it would be a very interesting time to just focus on the story and the characters and the courtroom itself. But there are many, many times where it is just constantly cutting away from that courtroom to interviews with people about what had happened. And I wish we could have just stayed in the courtroom and focused on what was going on, what was happening, what the arguments were, and so that internally the audience can determine who they would side with in this argument. Who do they agree with? Why do they agree with that person? So on, so on, so on. That's what makes it more impactful for me as a watcher, is trying to figure out my own opinion on the information that is being provided. And I feel like the amount of biases in the arguments being presented of the bystanders is affecting my own judgment of the characters in the story that's being presented, which I think becomes an issue for me as a viewer who's trying to determine how I feel about Bernie TD in reality based on the context of this film, of what they're trying to tell. And I think the whole point was to make Bernie seem like a better person than he probably actually is. I mean, he did kill a woman. It's a terrible thing to do. One of the worst things you could do. And I think they're trying to make him seem better in a light, trying to make you empathize with him, which I understand. I understand trying to do that, but I think a lot of the interviews, a lot of them are with real people who lived there at the time, and a lot of them are actors. But the interviews that are being shown spend a lot of time degrading Marjorie Nugent, and it does seem bizarre to take the perspective of this woman was murdered. Let's tell the murderer's side of the story and really deface this woman who's dead, who can't fend for herself, who can't make the argument otherwise that maybe she was a decent person. And she might not have been, she might not have been. I mean, that's the whole point of the movie, is you're just taking other people's opinions and trying to form your own based on them, which is never an ideal thing to do. Obviously, first person perspective is going to be a lot stronger, but the whole point is just to make a case for Bernie. The movie's called Bernie. It's about Bernie. It's supposed to be about, like, how can you be pushed to your limit? Can the nicest man in the world commit the worst of sins? Apparently so. Even he can be pushed to his limit. And, you can come to your own conclusions about Bernie. Watching the movie or reading about him, it's up to you. I still think he belongs in jail. Maybe he can receive parole soon. It's been a long time. It's been 30 years that he's been in prison. He was briefly released in 2014, I want to say, a little bit after the movie came out. He was briefly released and then re-imprisoned when a jury found that he shouldn't be released. So he was sent back to prison for the same thing. There's still fights for him to get an appeal. He can appeal again in 2029, I believe, at the end of the decade, at which point he will be very, very old. It's been 30 years. He's already in his 40s when this happened. To each their own. Make the impression that you want. The pros of the movie, though, I would say the performances are fantastic. I think Jack Black is giving like one of his career bests here. He's very much committed to this role of this very, very nice fella who's just trying to do his best, who happens to make the gravest of mistakes. I think Shirley MacLaine is killing it, even though she's not in it as much as I would like her to be. I wish she was in it more, because she is doing a really good job of being this very, very crazy, controlling character. I would like to see her more doing that, but she gets, killed off a little over halfway into the movie, and then she doesn't really show up much after that. She's not really in the beginning 20 minutes of the movie, so she has a very limited role to work with in the first place. Matthew McConaughey, of course, incredible as always, playing Danny Buck. He's not in as much as I would like either, but of course his role is diminished to the last 30 minutes of the movie with the court sequences, which they cut away from a lot in the first place, and then also they do make up for it by giving him moments in interviews earlier in the movie before his character is officially introduced. So I guess that's kind of a pro, but I would just like to see more of Danny Buck in the courtroom, because I think it's very funny. I like seeing him trying to do his attention grab. I think it's funny. The style of humor itself is very like self-effacing. I think it's very much pointing a camera at a character and have a character being very committed to what they are doing, even though it is kind of silly, and not caring about what others think. And I think that is appealing. I think it's very funny to me to watch. It's very entertaining, I would say, about Richard Linklater's, like, the comedy in his movies. School of Rock is like this as well. Just very, very much not trying to do too much, not trying to be overly funny, not trying to stick a very, very heavy punchline, but being very, very subtle in the comedy that's happening, and just kind of letting the actors do what they need to do in front of a very still camera, and be very much in tune with the world that they're in, not feel like they're separated at all, not feel like the world is bizarre, the character is bizarre. Everything is very much normal in the world that is happening that you're watching, but you, the audience who's watching it, is kind of laughing because it is a little out there, a little ridiculous that this is happening. And so I think that is appealing to me. I think the subtlety of that is very funny, and I think it does a lot to build out Bernie as a movie. in terms of just taking it from a normal sort of dark movie about a guy who kills a woman he was infatuated with and kind of making it this funny thing of he did this, but nobody really thought he could. Nobody. It was all just so flabbergasted crazy because, I mean, he was Bernie. He was just the nice guy. He was the guy everybody loved. He was in the musicals, and he was very, very generous and very good with everybody. Who knew that he could have the ability to kill a woman and stick her in a freezer for months and months and months? You know, who thought that? Nobody thought that. So I enjoyed the movie. I watched it when I was in high school for the first time, a long, long time ago. Did not realize it was Richard Linklater. Just wanted to see it because I had heard a lot of good things about Jack Black in it, and I'm a big Jack Black fan. I love Matthew McConaughey. I love Shirley MacLaine. So I watched it in high school, and I enjoyed it then, and I hadn't seen it since. And so when I was watching Hitman, and I was looking into Richard Linklater because I liked Hitman so much, which we'll get into in a second, is when I realized that he had made Bernie as well. And I made the connection, especially because they were both written or based on articles by Skip Hollandsworth. So they are connected in that regard as well. I made the connection that these are similarly themed kind of stories of characters who are seemingly very good people, very nice people who are starting to make more and more questionable choices and trying to associate humor with that in that regard, which I think makes these movies more interesting and more entertaining to watch. I just think Bernie has issues with a structure standpoint. Other than that, I think it's a solid story. I think it's a funny movie. I think it's entertaining. I just wish, again, we could have focused more on the characters and less on the impression that the characters are leaving on the other townspeople in the story who we don't know anything about, really. All that being said, I would give this movie I would say 3 out of 5 Shirley MacLaine's in the freezer. I'll give it 3 out of 5. Now I can talk about Hitman, which of course came out this year. It's been 13 years since Bernie came out. He's returning to the world of what was supposed to be Texas. I mean, the real Gary Johnson lived in Texas, so the story was supposed to take place in Texas, but I think because of tax break reasons, they filmed it in New Orleans. So it takes place in New Orleans, but it's taking us back to that sort of kind of dark story that is really more entertaining than anything. It's about Gary Johnson, who's a real life person who participated in undercover sting operations for the police department of a town in Texas. I'm not sure which town. And he would basically pose as contract killers so that they could arrest people looking for killer for hire schemes. And of course, this movie, unlike Bernie, takes a ton of liberties. They basically take the basic idea that Gary Johnson was a real person who was a dope ass chiller, cool dude, and they take his character and they invent a world around it. It's now in New Orleans, of course, which I think was a tax thing, and populate it with a bunch of fictional characters. And the whole idea is the identity issue of somebody pretending to be a killer for hire. At what point are you changing your personality, or what point are you no longer yourself? In what way are you taking these elements of these characters you're playing and imparting them on your life? Can you change your personality? Can you change your identity? They're taking those themes and they're mixing it with a very much fictional story version of Gary Johnson's life. They emphasize very heavily at the end of the movie that what happens in the movie Gary Johnson did not actually do, because then Gary Johnson would be a bad person. But no, Gary Johnson was a good guy, real guy, and they're just taking his real life story and they're fictionalizing it in order to tell a more complicated story, which I think is a bold move, and I am very much in favor of it. I think I've said on this podcast multiple times, I'm not the biggest fan of biopics. It's not something I find interesting, just because when you make a biopic, inherently you will get details wrong and you will make mistakes, unlike a documentary, which can be a lot more objective. In a biopic, you are fictionalizing many details in order to fit a film structure, and that inherently kind of spoils the whole point of what the movie's supposed to be, which is why I like the idea of taking a real life story and openly changing elements of it to make a fictional story that then fits into the themes you're trying to connect with the real thing you're trying to talk about. I am very much in favor of that, which is why I think Hitman works so well for me personally. I liked it quite a bit. Uh, I think it has a lot of the same pros that Bernie has in terms of the humor that they're using here, the sitcom scenario situations of these very high stakes lies that are going on with these characters, the moral conundrums of what they're doing and whether it's right or wrong, and then overall just the general appreciation of the use of identity as a theme so strongly in the film. I think is a very, very great idea. The idea that very early on in the film, he's talking to his ex-wife, and his ex-wife is arguing. I think she's a therapist or something. They don't really elaborate, but they're arguing. She's arguing that there are proven studies that your personality can change over an extended period of time, over like months and months of trying to change your personality. You can change aspects of your personality should you want to be. He says at the very end of the film, "Be the person you want to be." These are all kind of like positive sort of things they're saying here, that if you are unhappy with yourself, fortunately for you, there are ways to change, and you are not in any way destroying the old version of yourself. You are simply altering it in a way that maybe you can like yourself more, and that you can be a more confident person, you can be a more interesting person. And the way they go about that is showing his change as he interacts with a person pretending to be someone he's not. So Gary Johnson is, of course, he's a philosophy professor in the movie, and he's just a big old nerd. As much as you can make Glenn Powell a nerd, he's got big old glasses, and he wears jean shorts and baggy polos, and he's got ugly parted hair, and he just talks about birds all the time. It's very boring to be around, and it's very clear that he's not like an appealing individual to anybody. Which, I mean, it's Glenn Powell. Of course he's appealing. I think they did. There's a lot of snarky comments online saying, wow, they really tried to convince me that Glenn Powell was a nerd. I think they did a pretty good job. I think Glenn Powell gave a good performance. I think they did the best they could to make, a legit Hollywood hunk into the biggest nerd that they possibly could. I think they did the best they could while still making it realistic that he could make the change that he makes. I think they were trying. They tried real hard, and I think it worked. In my opinion, I think it does stick the landing in terms of trying to make him seem nerdy. I mean, even if he is handsome, they gave him a really bad haircut and big old glasses that blocked most of his face, and then they gave him a lot of dialogue about birds and cats and stuff. And it did convince me that he would be somebody that an average person might find uninteresting, even though he does have a ridiculously chiseled body as a result of Top Gun and other films of that nature that he's been in. They did the best they could. They did with what they could with what they had, and I stand by that. But he goes from this character to now he's installing audio equipment for the police for these sting operations, and then all of a sudden the guy who's pretending to be the killer for hire, he gets suspended or something from the police force because he's a terrible cop. And now Gary has to fill in that position, and he's very nervous because he's, like the nerdy guy. He's going in, he's pretending to be a killer, and all of a sudden he realizes he's very good at it. He's very good at pretending to be this alpha male machismo figure. And then he starts to do more of these killer for hire stings. He starts to tailor the personalities of the killer to whoever he's, doing the operation on, whoever he's trying to arrest. And he starts to really, really, really get interested in the whole performance of it all, pretending to be this character, pretending to be this version of himself that he's not. It's kind of like it's making the argument of like why acting might be appealing to a person, of trying as much as you can be and committing as much as you can be to being this thing that you're not, to see how far you're willing to go, that sort of commitment kind of thing. And the appeal of that is kind of an interesting thing to talk about. And I think it works on just about every level in terms of applying a theme and making that argument very concisely. I think it does really good. I think if Ryan were here, he would be agreeing with me, and he would be saying he had a delightful time. and that he really engaged with the themes and how they were presenting, especially if he had seen it on multiple watches. And I think he'd be going, yes, yes, I agree. Yes, that's exactly what he would be saying. So it's as if he's here right now, Ryan in spirit. And so I hope when he's done filming and he has more free time, he goes and watches Hitman, which would be really easy because it's on Netflix. You can watch it anytime. I watched it twice now on Netflix. Go see it. It's a good movie. But anyway, what was I? I was talking about identity. Yes, the theme of identity and whatnot. I think they apply it very well. I think they did a very good job. Uh, I like seeing how his character changes as he is hanging out with Madison, the female lead, Adria Arjona. He's spending more time with her, pretending to be Ron, the hitman. I think him spending time in that role and you seeing how that affects his average life as Gary, I think that's very interesting. He starts to be more of a confident teacher. He's all of a sudden, for some reason, no longer teaching in this shitty classroom. He's now teaching like outside and in this fancy amphitheater. It's like his whole life looks seemingly upgraded, which I think is a strong choice to show how being Ron and like letting Ron seep into the Gary life is affecting him positively. He's being this version of himself that he likes. Ron is a very confident guy. He's a smooth talker. He knows how to dress well. He knows when to bring up certain topics and when not. He's just a very charming and very cool dude. And so he lets Ron seep into his life as Gary, and that takes Gary's life and starts to improve it, which I think is a strong message to show that, like, hey, sometimes it's okay to pretend to be these things that you're not if it means you are changing yourself for the better while still holding on to what makes you. I think it's important. He talks about early in the movie, giving one of his classes, he says, how many of you have a sense of self? And nobody really raises their hand, and then he gets them all to raise their hand. He goes, of course you have a sense of self. Everybody has a sense of self. You know who you are. You know who you're trying to be. Acknowledge that sense of self. It's what we spend most of our time thinking about is who we are. It's who we know. It's what we know best is who we are and what we are. And then he has the conversation with his ex-wife about changing personality, which I think is a good conversation that they have. And then Ron starts to seep more and more into his life, and he starts to see those positive changes. And I like that the drama that is going on with the characters is not necessarily an internal one as a result of that conflict. It's not that Ron and Gary are now fighting for control over his life. It's more of the external conflict of Madison's ex-husband is crazy. He's lying to Madison about his identity. Madison eventually ends up killing her husband. Like, there's all these external conflicts that are going on that are the true conflict of the story, but that internal conflict of Ron versus Gary isn't necessarily a problem. We see that at the end of the film, he talks about how he finds the right mix of Ron and Gary. It's not a problem that he has supplanted part of his personality with Ron, because the part of Gary is still there. You see him talking to his daughter about birds. He's still fascinated and whatnot, but he's not overbearing about it. He's not obnoxious in any way. He's still a smooth charmer. He's still very cool. He allows Ron to be more of himself because he likes who he is as Ron. Because in all honesty, Ron's a cool fucking dude. Ron's a cool guy. Who the fuck wouldn't want to be Ron? He's cool as shit. In no way is he like douchey or judgmental. He's just a chill, cool dude. He's a bunch of like positive personality traits that he then starts to bring into his Gary life, which I think is a positive message. But the negative aspects of it is that he's now, as Ron, pretending to be a contract killer, dating a girl who thinks he's a contract killer and is okay with it. And he highlights that sort of problem, that isn't it a problem that she's into a contract killer, and is it a problem that I'm into the fact that she's into a contract killer? That's the internal struggle that's going on. Is this a good thing to have happen now? Is this bad? I suppose, should I not be doing this? And then we get the great scene where he finds out that she killed her husband, and a lot of good comedy beats here of the reveal of information where he's saying, I just wanted you to like Ron. I didn't want you to meet Gary. And she goes, who the fuck is Gary? A lot of good funny bits in here. A lot of good funny moments. A lot of good chuckles that he got out of me. I had a much of a blast watching the humorous bits of this movie, because it's very much sitcom-y, juggling sitcom situations on like the highest of stakes. and they're getting away with it every time, which I think is what's most fun about it, is that there's constantly obstacles thrown at them to get in the way of him getting away with his lies, her getting away with her lies, and then they both just kind of like find a way to get away with it, which then ties into what the ex-wife was saying earlier in the movie about how he just needs to find somebody whose crazy matches his crazy. He does. It's Madison. Their crazy matches each other. It turns out he's willing to kill in order to uh for the greater good of society, which goes into the conversations having with the students, where the modern day society is saying, oh, we could never kill, killing is wrong, state sanctioned killing is not the answer, but the Neolithic society, when presented with the same situation, would probably kill. And he says, that is historically possibly the right choice. It's widely believed that sometimes in the past it has been appropriate to kill somebody in order for the betterment of society. And he's like making that argument, and then later in the movie, of course, he kills Jasper, who they've made clear throughout the movie nobody likes, nobody wants him around. Not saying that his death was justified, but he's justifying as much as he can. And he's very similarly to Bernie making the argument that maybe killing is okay, which I think is a very funny thing to end off on that movie with. Uh, I think it's a strong film in terms of communicating how identity works and uh, how it's going to how changing your identity is possible and can be healthy if done in a certain way. I think the only disadvantages of the movie is that it doesn't show any negative side effects of trying to change your identity. Of course, it doesn't hammer that point home that Ron makes bad. Obviously, Ron is the part of him that is killing Jasper near the end. The Gary would never do that, but Ron would make that choice in order to sacrifice Jasper for the betterment of everybody. It doesn't really hit the nail on the head that that's a bad thing, that maybe Ron shouldn't do this, that they're making a bad choice. I think the only thing that'd be more beneficial is if we saw more of Ron leaking into Gary's life being a bad thing, and him having to really truly find that proper mix of Ron and Gary. Because if you ask me, he finds that mix very quickly. They go hand in hand with one another. Gary is a very intelligent and non-judgmental kind of person, and Ron is a very cool and relaxed kind of character, and they blend well to make this very interesting and charismatic character in Gary that is very appealing, that makes him very cool. And they don't really show any negative. They very much have positives that kind of go hand in hand with one another, which is great. If you can find more positive characteristics to add to your personality and you can become a better person as a result, why not do that? Why do anything else? If there's no cons towards supplementing your personality with positive traits, why would you not do that? Of course. And of course, this takes a long time to do. It takes a long time to get into that habit of being a better person, but it is possible and it can be done. I think it just doesn't make the argument for being cautious and being very self-aware of what it is you're doing and what it is you're trying to do, because there could be negative consequences as a result. Because for these characters, ultimately, there are no consequences. They get away with everything that happens. They get away with multiple murders. They get away with lying to one another. It's like the only con of the movie is that nothing bad happens, which is fine. I mean, we of course want Gary to get away with it. By the end of the movie, we love him. We love Madison. We love the chemistry they have together. Adria Jordan and Glenn Powell are fantastic in the scenes together. We want them to get away with it. But I wish there were more consequences in terms of. I kind of wish, a part of me wishes story wise they didn't get away with it. Like Glenn Powell gets caught and he goes to prison, but Madison's out on the end, and you get sort of like an ending where she goes to see him in prison, but they're both happy and they're both content with being with one another. And he, I don't know, maybe has like a 10-year sentence or something, and he can get out. And you see that he does find the mix of Ron and Gary, and he's like living a great life in prison because he's able to control the two very well. I think maybe that would have hammered home the lesson of you can supplement parts of your personality, but don't let part of that be an actual contract killer. Don't let that be the part of the personality that filters into you, possibly, would be a better way to hammer home, especially since that whole part of the story is the fictionalized portion. You can make it come out any way you want it to, you know. But I think in the end, they chose to have a happy ending because they cared so much about the character. And of course, the real Gary Johnson they cared about. And they wanted him to just seem like the coolest dude ever, which I'm sure he was, and try to emphasize like how self-aware he probably was as a person and how impactful he was in terms of his presence in the police force and his efforts in these undercover stings and his ability to craft these identities as contract killers and to get these convictions. How strong a sense of self was in him to be able to do that, I think, is what they're trying to get across. And that is what Gary in the movie is doing as well. He has a very strong sense of self, and he's able to change that sense of self over time very quickly because of how strong it is. He's able to affect his own personality over the course of a few months because he's aware of who he is, and he has done that reflection as a character even before the movie even starts. Is very comfortable with who he is, very comfortable with liking cats and birds and being a little nerdy, and then he discovers this sort of identity that he can fall into and realizes he can adapt to this identity and likes himself even more as a result. I think that's a positive message to get across, to be willing to experiment with how you see yourself and how you act in order to be the best version of yourself you can be without going too far. I wish he didn't kill somebody in the end. It kind of just undercuts the point that they're trying to make. But overall, I think it's a fun movie. I think it does really good with the concept of identity. I think it's a fun ride. I had a good time. I enjoy the characters. I enjoy the situations. I enjoy the way it's filmed. I enjoy the humor. I enjoy everything. But I like all of the little bits of Glenn Powell dressing up as the contract killers and meeting all the clients. All the fun he has coming up with those characters and doing all those impressions. I love the Patrick Bateman one where he's just in a full suit with his hair slicked back and doing a full Christian Bale impression. There's just so much fun that's being made in this movie that it's hard not to enjoy it from my perspective, even with like any kind of lapse of morality towards the end. I still think I had so much fun watching the movie itself that it's for sure worth a watch and is definitely a good ride. So to leave off on a note, I would say all pie is good pie, and I rate this movie 4 pies out of 5. All right, that's all the time we have. If you'd like to give your thoughts on the show, you can email us at theboxofficeshowpod@gmail.com. Our main title theme for the show is Sundown by Joseph McDade. If you like the show, please give us 5 stars, whatever podcast I've been listening to, and be sure to tune in next week. Have a great rest of your day.